It's time. It's time. Hello and very good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the LSE Gender Welcome Lecture 2025. This is the first public lecture and it kicks off our year-long public events program, which of course I am looking forward to seeing you all at through the course of the year. The timing of this lecture is important, of course. As the title suggests, the Welcome Lecture is an event to welcome the new cohort of gender students, our visitors and alumni, to the new academic year at the department, to the LSE, and into the department's intellectual life and world. My name is Sumi Madhok, and I'm Professor of Political Theory and Gender Studies at the Department of Gender Studies and also the Head of Department of Gender Studies. And it is my great pleasure to chair this evening's LSE Gender Welcome Lecture. Every year, the Welcome Lecture is given by a member of the department's faculty. It showcases an important strand of the state-of-the-art research that is carried out in the department and introduces students and all our visitors and alumni and even faculty to the new work being done by a member of our department. It also importantly introduces our new cohort of students to the global thinking on gender. Our faculty are global thinkers who think about contemporary questions that animate thinking on our planet. The research and teaching, because MSc teaching at the LSE is research-led teaching, is led by an urgency to not only respond to, but also intervene theoretically and empirically and conceptually in contemporary gendered life and living around the globe. I'm delighted to say that this year, the Welcome Lecture will be given by Dr. Rohit Dasgupta, who is on my right. Dr. Rohit Dasgupta is Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality at the Department of Gender Studies and also the Program Director of MSc Program in Gender and Sexuality. He's also, if that weren't enough, the Deputy Head of Department for Research. Dr. Dasgupta's research interests lie in cultural and queer politics in South Asia and its global diaspora. He is also very interested in the role of digital culture and media for social change in relation to activism and intimate community making. He has just begun a new 3-year Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project titled Crafting Sustainability and Equitability, which explores cultural labor in the Indian handicraft sector with an aim to address inequalities of gender, sexuality, religion, and caste from an intersectional perspective. Rohit is the recipient of many prestigious grants, including from the Wellcome Trust, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the British Academy, Carnegie Trust, UKRI, and the AHRC. As an interdisciplinary and a multi-method scholar, Rohit's first book, Digital Queer Cultures in India, Politics, Intimacies and Belonging, published by Routledge in 2017, uses ethnographic and creative methodologies to explore the relationship between sexuality, class, and belonging. This book, published in 2017, was quickly followed by a series of other books, all published in 2018. Queering Digital India, Activisms, Identities, Subjectivities, Edinburgh University Press, Social Media, Sexuality and Sexual Health, published by Bloomsbury in 2018, and Friendship as Social Justice Activism, published by the University of Chicago Press, which received an honorable mention by PEN America. His latest and just recently published book is titled Desi Queers, LGBTQI plus South Asians and Cultural Belongings in Britain, which is, as I said, just been published, so it's just hot off the press. But I'm also kind of breathless to let you know that he's also published another book. I was feeling very inadequate as I was writing this.
I did not provide that, by the way.
Is the author of a second book published this year titled India's Imperial Formations, Cultural Perspectives, published by Farley Dickinson University Press. So outside his very demanding and very busy life within academia and at the LSE, Dr. Dasgupta is also engaged firsthand in policy making and political strategy. He is an elected councillor in the London Borough of Newham in the areas of equality, social justice, and culture. and has been so for a number of years. And actually, and here's a little bit of news I thought I'd share with you, and you're privy alongside me to this news. Nobody else is, because it hasn't been published or publicly declared thus far. But I was actually quite delighted to hear that Rohit has just been awarded the Freedom of the City of London honour. Whoa! So in typical Rohit fashion, his answer to my question was like, okay, so what's that? That's my typical question to most things. So what's that? And he said to me, well, it just allows me to graze goats over, Westminster Bridge or something. But this is an honor given to Londoners, which was first presented in, any guesses?
1412.
Close enough, but not quite. Anybody else?
1850.
The second half, subsequently somewhat close, but not the first time. When is the first time? Come on, everyone. No? Gone, went, no? Okay, fine. 1237, right? So which was first presented, so I did my research on this. So presented first in 1237, but since 1835, it has been presented to honor people living or working in the city or those with strong London connections. I think it's a lovely award. So I'm sure by now you're all extremely interested in all the many things that Rohit does. So can I suggest you take a long, quick, hard look at his LSE faculty webpage, which provides details of their publications and interventions. So the order of this afternoon's events is as follows. Dr. Dasgupta will deliver their lecture for around 50 minutes. This will be followed by an audience Q&A. This is then your chance to ask him questions. And after that, there will be a congratulatory reception just outside the lecture theatre. I've been told it's just outside here. And to congratulate Dr. Dasgupta and for everyone to get a chance to mingle over drinks. Please welcome our first public lecturer of the year, Dr. Rohit Dasgupta.
Thank you, Sumi, for embarrassing me a lot. I did not provide that biography, by the way, people. But thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for attending, for being here today and attending my first public lecture in LSE. I also want to thank some of the former students who are here. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the staff at LSE Gender. It's been a wonderful year, and it's been very, very productive, and I've really, really had a great time. So thank you so much again for that. So, because I know that I'm between this and the drinks outside, I am going to try and be quick, but also not too quick. I have been told I speak too fast. So, I'm going to start off with a quote. But before I start with the quote, I do also want to give a slight trigger warning. I will be using certain words in the lecture today, which could be distressing. They are racist words. I will not speak them out loud, but they will be on the slides, and you will understand why I've had to use them for this particular presentation. So, can you all hear me in the back? Excellent. So I'll start with this quote. I'm a gay 17-year-old, A-level student. Although I was born in Britain, my parents originate from Pakistan and are very strict Muslims. My parents have arranged a marriage for me that will take place sometime next year. I do not know what to do. How can I explain to them that I'm gay? This brief but deeply moving extract comes from a letter that was sent in 1983 by a young man in Rochdale, Lancashire, to the gay black group in London. His words, though written decades ago, continue to echo through time, resonating with the experiences of many queer South Asians. They capture the tensions of identity, faith, family, sexuality. Stories like his form the foundation of my lecture, which traces queer South Asian life in Britain from the 1980s. The project that underpins this work draws on three main types of primary material. The first is archival collections, including the voices of or about queer South Asians in Britain. When this research began, approaching various archives with inquiries were often met with silence or polite refusals. Yet persistence, along with the dedication of some archivists, recent community-led archival initiatives, and the informal archives held by individuals, unearthed a wealth of material. Much of it had been hidden away, old floppy disks. Does anyone know what floppy disks are? Boxes in attics, personal newsletters. What once appeared useless had suddenly become invaluable. The second material was interviews that we did with around 28 people. And finally, looking at the cultural work of artists, photographers, filmmakers, and musicians. At a time when queer heritage projects are far from their peak, these materials have potential value in sectors of the heritage economy keen to do what Sarah Ahmed calls diversity work. Among the most significant finds was a multi-year run of Shakti Khabar, the newsletter of Shakti, which was founded in 1988, and is widely credited as the first queer South Asian organization in Britain. Shakti not only provided a vital lifeline for South Asian queers, but also incubated initiatives that grew into established institutions, some of which you might know in this room, such as NAS Foundation and Club Kali, the latter still running as a queer South Asian club more than 30 years later. Such discoveries show how ephemeral, fragile, and yet enduring queer South Asian history can be, and how it constantly slips between the margins of what is considered nationally significant. My lecture today is going to draw on a British Academy project called Cross-Border Queers with Professor Churnjit Maan, and the book that later followed, Desi Queers with Churnjit and with DJ Ritu, which charts the story of South Asian queer organizing and cultural production in Britain from the 1980s until the present. For the purposes of this lecture today, I will focus on three different kinds of cultural production: nightlife, print culture, and photography. I'm deliberately not going to take you down a chronology, though I will offer a bit of a political background to set the scene. So, you're going to encounter political characters, artists, DJs, and activists. And along the way, I will also reflect on the importance of friendship, love, kinship, as the affective glue that held these communities together. So let's begin this story in 1987. On 2nd of May 1987, thousands of protesters gathered in London for Smash the Backlash, the first national black queer demonstration against racism and homophobia. Organized by Haringey Black Action, Smash the Backlash called for a coalition of racialized gays and lesbians to unite against the state-enabled right-wing attacks on progressive social and political movements, especially in London. One of the leaflets for the protest, entitled Black People Fight Bigotry, featured an image of the South Asian deity Kali, and carried a call from the Black Panther Party to stand with all oppressed groups. Kali, over here, was used as a figure, evoking the revolutionary potential of destruction entwined with the creative potential of feminine energy. Behind her was a generation of queer South Asians in 1980s Britain, many of them migrants or the children of working-class first-generation migrants, facing down state-sponsored racism and homophobia. And their story is the beginning of the multi-generational account of Desi queers in London. From the early 1980s, the Labour-run Greater London Council had pledged itself to distributing funding to minoritized groups in the city and setting up equality units as part of a coordinated approach to tackle key social inequalities. This would make the GLC a particular anathema to the Thatcher government, who made the council's closure a manifesto promise, which they did. The North London borough of Haringey had particularly acquired a reputation for radical action. It had been the site of the Broadwater Farm Estate resistance in 1985 in response to the endemic police violence towards Black and South Asian communities. London's first lesbian and gay unit, focused on challenging structural heterosexism, was also based in the borough, taking what we would now call an intersectional approach, incorporating the experiences of working class, disabled, gendered, sexualized, and racial bodies at the heart of this unit's work. It wasn't, however, long before Haringey Lesbian and Gay Unit would find itself at the heart of a controversy that would change the shape of LGBTQ+ civil rights across the country. Some of you in the audience will have lived through it. the consequences of what came. The HLGU's policy to improve the positive representations of LGBT people included highlighting a book for primary school children that depicted a gay couple as parents. The media and the political furor that followed depicted the initiative as a wholesale attack on the nuclear family. To use another word that we have now come up with in the kind of contemporary anti-equalities work, it was seen as woke gone mad. The local leader of Haringey, Bernie Grant, was dubbed Barmy Barney in all of the papers for his own support of Haringey's equality work. But Haringey's small-scale initiative to provide positive images of queer life was successfully weaponized by the right wing, political parties, media, and organizations. And the debates that started in Parliament in response to this work would eventually result in the amendment to the Local Government Act of 1986, and commonly what is now known as Section 28, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities. And for those of you who don't know, it wasn't until 2000 it was repealed in Scotland, and 2003 when it was finally repealed in England and Wales. The defined national protests in the lead up to Section 28 have now become part of this very heroic narrative of queer resistance. If the miners' strike of 1984 is defined as the defining protest for working class communities of the 1980s, the fight back against Section 28 was also the definitive protest for queer and trans lives. But what's missing from this story is the fundamental contribution of Black and queer of color resistance to Section 28. The resistance to Section 28 was not, however, a single issue protest. Haringey Black Action framed the lead up to Section 28 as just an example in a series of assaults on minoritized lives in this country. The leaflets for Smash the Backlash called for consciousness raising amongst Black and queer communities, and as you can see from the quote over there, state attacks on all working class people, especially Black people, are intensifying. Black resistance to these attacks will continue to increase. The resistance is not separate from fighting attacks on Black sisters or on Black lesbians and gays. One of the important backdrops in the work of the Labour-run Greater London Council, which from the early 1980s until its abolition in 1986, committed unprecedented funding to minoritized groups in London, was also the ascent of Thatcherite neoliberalism, but marked by a newly resourced group of minoritized groups through Ken Livingstone and the GLC of that time. For example, in 1984, you had GLC's Anti-Racist Year, and in 1987 became the first Black History Month. It would emerge from this anti-racist local authority work. And whilst there was a lot of internal wrangling within the Labour Party, wanting to be more moderate, where have we heard that before? To be more electable, where have we heard that before? A much broader range of left socialist politics was playing out in local branches and local authorities in London. So South Asian queer activism in the 1970s and early 1980s emerged in this context of rife anti-Black and anti-South Asian racism that sought to categorize mostly working class migrants and racially minoritized communities as a danger to Britain's public health, moral integrity, and cultural coherency. It also emerged at a pivotal moment in British queer and anti-racist history, from the Brixton riots of 1981 to the Newham 7 defense campaign of 1987. A generation of queer South Asians found their orientation through a language of anti-oppression and solidarity platforms. As Sabi Hensman points out, perhaps we were something of an exception, yet queer South Asians coming out to ourselves and maybe others in the late 70s and 80s often interacted with older people in communities of color who were themselves rebelling against these patriarchal norms. Despite the media interest in characterizing South Asian communities as insular and conservative, the South Asian anti-imperial activism that developed in Britain from the late 19th century continued on. It took aim at the shifting strategies of cultural imperialism and state-sponsored racism, co-locating with other movements, including the women's movement and within the broader umbrella of political blackness. And it is here that we begin to see the outlines of queer South Asian cultural production, a practice that was simultaneously aesthetic and political, but also rooted in the urgent need to claim space. So throughout this lecture, I'm going to be using Desi as a conceptual framework to think about specific experiments in aesthetic and cultural formations tied to diasporic life, while keeping South Asia as a geographical marker. This framing builds on the earlier work of Gayatri Gopinath and Jigna Desai, who identified the potential of the Brown Atlantic to illuminate connections and tensions between British and North American queer South Asian diasporas. So adapting Paul Gilroy's influential concept of the Black Atlantic, the Brown Atlantic traces South-South relations through these long histories of South Asian diaspora, beginning with the movement of indentured labor in the 19th century across the Indian Ocean, Africa, and the Caribbean. And within this broader landscape, I foreground Desi stories that have flourished in queer economies outside the mainstream regimes of recognition. So here I'm also deliberately using the word story rather than history, because a story often carries some kind of second-order legitimacy, treated with skepticism by empirical frameworks that demand proof of veracity. Yet stories are also vehicles of knowledge production and transmission, embedding moral and philosophical insights through care. And this framing would also allow us to see queer South Asian identities not as fixed or bounded or simply British, but as shaped by the longer histories of indenture, post-colonial migration, and diasporic flows. For instance, the trajectories of South Asians who migrated to East Africa as indentured laborers under the British Empire and whose descendants later moved to Britain in the 1960s and 70s illustrate how histories overlap and reshape diasporic life. Similarly, the circulation of Bollywood films across London, Toronto, San Francisco, New York creates a shared cultural repertoire for South Asians in dispersed locations. And when queerness enters this frame, identities become even more layered, formed in dialogue with these multiple histories, aesthetics, and communities. In practice, queer South Asians in Britain were never solely oriented towards their own communities. They engaged with queer movements elsewhere, learning from and building solidarities across difference. In Britain, they worked with Black and Caribbean queer activists, recognizing shared experiences of racialized exclusion. They looked to feminist movements in South Asia that critiqued family structures, and they drew from North American queer of color politics, particularly in the 80s and 90s. So this queer brown Atlantic is therefore not just a metaphor, it is lived reality. For queer South Asians coming out in Britain in the 70s and 80s, political blackness and black feminism were not only frameworks for analysis, but also vocabularies of survival. In a media and a social environment that was saturated with racism and heterosexism, solidarity was essential. And solidarity over here operates in two senses. First, following Sarah Ahmed, black feminist philosophy and action functioned as a lifeline for emerging queer feminist and anti-racist aesthetics. And rather than treating queer South Asian life as marginal, the margin itself becomes a generative space for resistance and community. Bell Hooks famously described the margin as a profound edge, a site that is difficult, risky, never safe, but also very, very necessary for creating alternative cultural and aesthetic practices, requiring a community of resistance. Examples from the 1980s demonstrate these solidarities in action. Sisters Against Disablement, for instance, produced access codes that were printed alongside adverts and posters for Black, lesbian, and feminist events. Similarly, the Lesbians and Policing Project, LesPop, created in 1985 as a part of the Gay London Police Monitoring Group, sought to tackle queerphobia within the police. Activist Chris Black extended this work into migrant communities, showing how lesbian feminist principles enabled the sharing of resources across difference. So for example, this particular LesPop poster, What to Do If the Police Raid, was even translated into Punjabi, underscoring how solidarity can be made tangible in multilingual and practical forms. So, how about we move from theory to practice, to the dance floor? Because if there is one space where queer brown Atlantic came alive in embodied and sensory form, it was nightlife. The dance floor has long stood at the front line of queer liberation. To many, it may appear as a little more than a space to move one's body. To music, Yet for queer communities across generations, the dance floor has been infinitely more than a place to dance. It is a space of survival, of joy in the face of exclusion, of community making, when other institutions denied belonging. To step onto a queer dance floor, then, is to enter a world where one's body, however briefly, might be free. But, of course, critical. The very right to such a dance floor has always been politicized. For queer people, nightlife has never been neutral. It has been shaped by battles against police raids, harassment, and surveillance, by the constant threat of landlords refusing queer tenants, by the relentless forces of gentrification and financial precarity that make sustaining such venues also difficult. The story of queer nightlife is also very similar, about resistance, about survival. For queer South Asians in Britain, nightlife took particular significance. Shakti Disco, which was founded in 1988, and Club Kali, which was launched in 1995, were not simply club nights. They also became very vital infrastructures. There were spaces where queer South Asians could travel from across the UK to meet one another for the first time. There were places of information sharing, especially during the AIDS crisis, as South Asians were considered particular hard-to-reach groups by public health campaigns. Many lived heteronormative lives in multi-generational homes, some in heterosexual marriages, and thus were also excluded from some of the dominant narratives of queer visibility. As British immigration regimes tightened also through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, queer South Asian migration became increasingly difficult unless one arrived through student visas or professional employment. For those escaping persecution, particularly from less privileged economic backgrounds, the stakes were high, and attending queer South Asian clubs could even be seen as evidence in asylum claims, as many of our interviewees mentioned, a documentation of one's queer life. So these nights were not just nights out, is what I'm trying to get. But crossing the threshold of a queer club has long been a rite of passage in countless coming out stories. But the journey to the dance floor is rarely straightforward. It required work, securing venues, negotiating with hostile owners. And once inside, queer South Asian spaces offered more than music, places of creative expression, of public health organizing, as I mentioned, of housing support networks, and so on. They represented, as sociologist Amin Kaziani puts it, unique ways of seeing and being in the world for those marginalized by multiple vectors of power. Nightlife, he reminds us, is transformative. But it also begs the question, what kind of worlds are being built over here and for whom? Queer nightlife, yes, it carries the promise of building more inclusive worlds on the margins of heteronormativity, but this promise is never pure. Nightlife also reproduces mundane forms of exclusion. In mainstream venues, whiteness continues to dominate. Trans people face hostility even within these queer circles. Racialized minorities find themselves hypervisible and out of place. As scholars Kemi Adiani, Karim Kupchandani, and Ramon Rivera Cervera caution, queer nightlife offers both refuge and alienation, sanctuary and exclusion. One interviewee recalled attending a Tea and Sympathy support group in central London in the mid-1980s. After the meetings, members would sometimes gather their coats and muster the courage to visit a nearby gay club. I quote, "Suddenly, 12 Asians would arrive out of somewhere in town, and no one over in the club had seen anything like this before. And as we entered, it was like a parting of waves to make space." The phrase "make space" resonates in two ways. Capturing this growing presence of queer South Asians insisting on their right to nightlife, but also the exclusionary gesture of white patrons physically moving aside, marking racialized bodies as outsiders. This was not exceptional, but expected. Racism was so normalized that it assumed courage would be required to simply walk through that door. Also, clubbing was not considered respectable by many first and second generation South Asian families. Several interviewees described being forbidden from going out, not only due to parental restrictions, but because of the racism that they face at the door. Yet queer South Asian life also did not emerge from a vacuum. It was born from these intersections or within broader urban scenes, house parties, sound systems, squat parties, largely pioneered by Black and South Asian musicians resisting racism, capitalism, and sexism. In the 1980s and 1990s, a new generation of South Asians developed an underground daytime rave scene in cities like London, Birmingham, and Bradford. These events fuse Bhangra with hip-hop, jungle, garage, reggae, techno, and house, producing hybrid sounds that reflected new ways of being British, rooted within kind of a diasporic creativity. Women played central roles. DJs like Radical Sister, Ran Kaur, DJ Ritu broke the stereotypes by claiming space behind the decks. One woman recalled dressing in salwar kameez for college, then changing into Western clothes in bathroom stalls before heading for the lunchtime raves. For others, cultural dress was deliberately reappropriated. One woman remembered wearing salwar kameez with Doc Martens to lesbian bar rackets. Anyone know? Yeah. I'm looking at you, Claire. She and her friends demanded Bhangra tracks from DJ taking over the floor and even dancing on the bar. They were not thrown out. A small miracle, as she recalled, but their presence marked a bold claim to visibility, inserting South Asian culture into spaces that long excluded it. The opening of the London Lesbian and Gay Centre in 1985 provided unprecedented infrastructure to queer organizing. Among its many initiatives, it was hosting this Shakti Disco. Anticipation was high, and the event exceeded expectations. For the first time, queer South Asians could openly celebrate their cultural heritage without the fear of judgment. Shakti was not simply a disco, it was a moment of convergence, as one interview mentioned, declaring that queer South Asians existed and demanded joy in their own terms. Held monthly in the LLGC basement, Shakti became quite legendary. While media coverage was muted, word of mouth spread fast. The venue's 300 capacity space filled with South Asians and allies alike. But threats loomed. Rumors of National Front attacks created panic, though they later proved to be false, but the climate of racism and hostility was inescapable. Still, Shakti established something very, very transformative. It was in many ways a part of what I've been calling the queer brown Atlantic, a transnational circuit of performers and DJs linking Britain, North America, and beyond. But by the late 1990s, Shakti's future dimmed. Key organizers left to pursue other projects. New venue management proved difficult, even hostile. For many, its closure felt like losing family. But DJ Ritu and her partner Rita saved enough from their day jobs to start anew. In 1995, they founded Club Kali at the Dome in Tufnell Park. If Shakti had broken ground, Kali cemented that legacy. It became an international legend, known for its electric mix of Bhangra, Bollywood, and global queer beats. It welcomed drag performers and genderqueer expression, offering a space for self-invention as much as for dancing. So one of the things I won't be able to go in today, there was a huge controversy in Shakti as well about cross-dressing and about trans performers as well, which in some ways Kali really, really managed to challenge in their new space, but I can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. So why don't we hear a little bit of what Kali plays? You can hear that more later. I've got another one later on, don't worry. Okay, so the story of queer South Asian nightlife reminds us that the dance floor has never been trivial. It has been and remains a space of political struggle. In the words of one club goer, these spaces were crazy, wonderful, and heady times. There were experiments in freedom, even if temporary, where the music never simply ended when the night was over. It reverberated in lives, in politics, and this enduring demand that queer South Asians belong on the dance floor and beyond. So, if nightlife gave queer South Asians a place to breathe, move, and express desire, print culture gave them a way to speak, document, and also connect across distance. For communities often dispersed and isolated living in towns far from London or in households where queerness had to be hidden, print culture was absolutely vital. Shakti was an organic outcome of years of queer and feminist politically black activism combined with a desire to find a queer South Asian community that was held together by cultural issues, family expectations, the practices of arranged marriage. And as the critical mass of black queer groups grew in the 1980s, the need to balance differences across racialized queer groups meant Shakti was part of an ethnic and cultural turn in organizing. Sunil Gupta was skeptical of a move away from political blackness to find political and cultural homes elsewhere. He says, if half of us do not accept being black, then work being done in our name is not reaching us. The subcontinent can be beckoning, but it is not the panacea as we are part of Britain. What made Shakti unique and supporting community building for queer South Asians would also be a part of its weakness. The steady move away from political blackness, the anchoring of South Asia, predominantly India actually by this time, as the imaginary and unifying site of home, whilst displacing some of the differences within the diaspora, also created new differences within it. The significant experience of active early Shakti members in youth and social work, the creative industries, and anti-racist grassroots organizing allowed Shakti to leverage experience into action. From its inception, political blackness and anti-imperial lesbian feminism provided a language and social consciousness that conditioned who Shakti was for and what it wanted to achieve. Its immediate success was largely due to the people who were involved in it initially, made up of intellectuals and creatives in the Black British arts movements, workers in local councils, and experienced organizers from anti-racist grassroots community organizations. They formed an influential network that had the knowledge, the cultural capital to build something new. This was a social collective that was driven by political imperatives that came out of the spectrum of London's left politics, bringing equally experiments of equality in local authorities alongside grassroots movements that were skeptical of the state. So to put it in another way, local authority-funded grassroots action over here was producing queer and anti-racist equalities infrastructure, which in some ways was determining how these movements happened. Within 2 years, Shakti Khabar was printing a 16-page newsletter 6 times a year and had a circulation of 500. Of which 100 copies were being sent to South Asia and North America. Shakti Khabar was distributed for free in South Asia via select university campus groups and personal networks, leading to a predominantly middle-class educated readership which did not mirror the UK readership. Like many collective-based newsletters of the period, Shakti Khabar's content was varied, although its early editor, Shivananda Khan, was scrupulous in using his editorial privilege. The newsletter's advertisement page and its media coverage gives a glimpse of Shakti's impact in late 80s Britain. So for example, Stonewall was advertising roles for workers, Lesbian Line was looking for volunteers, Only Women's Press, which later became Women's Press, was looking for contributions from South Asians, and a hotel in Scarborough was announcing its doors were firmly open to Shakti members. So although its early issues did not include helplines for UK-based black and lesbian gay organizations, they did include numbers for organizations in North America and India, like Trikon and Kush and others. Demonstrating Shakti's changing orientation from queer politically black organizing in UK towards this transnational queer South Asian and brown networks. And although based in London, Shakti Khabar's reporting by this time and the content it was producing was spending more time in India than in Bradford and Birmingham. The networking section of the newsletter was dominated by men in India and the broader South Asian continent, and thus was completely losing out on the work that they were supposed to be doing over here. So whilst Shakti was not a minor part of queer organizing in London, and nor was it invisible within South Asian diaspora in Britain, it also was creating this sort of different kind of differences within its kind of core groupings. As Pratibha Parmar reflects in 1993, when I first came out 12 years ago, there were very few South Asian LGBT people around. We knew we were around and would travel hundreds of miles to meet. But now, 12 years later, we have Shakti, very strong, over 1,000-member group with a newsletter, regular meetings, and socials. For some of the members, Shakti would rewrite the script of traditional South Asian family values by harnessing a collective energy that was bent towards the creation of a queer South Asian community. As one interview comments, just in terms of sharing about Shakti, I guess it was like finding a family. It was very much like finding a family. And it was exciting. We were doing new things. We were working together. Okay, I just realized the time. I've been speaking for too long. So I'm going to move quickly on to the final cultural production that I'm going to talk about, which is art. So whilst club spaces, publications provided vital arenas for community building and political organizing, visual and cinematic art carved out equally significant spaces where South Asian queer identities could be articulated and explored. Art became not only an outlet for creativity, but also, as I've been saying, political tool for resistance and community care. So in this lecture, I'm going to particularly just talk about two figures. In the book, we talk about 8 figures, but I'll just bring up 2. One is Pratibha Parmar, and the other one is Sunil Gupta. But before I kind of delve into their work, I actually wanted to start off with the work of Mumtaz Karimji, who was one of the early trailblazers whose work bridged feminist, queer, and anti-racist concerns. Her seminal essay on the intersection of Black and Asian identities and the importance of asserting a distinct identity was published in 1987 in the feminist magazine Mukti. The issue also featured Karimji's striking photograph of a tree. I could not actually find the image for today's, from the cover image for today's lecture, but I do have an image from where the cover came. The image was not simply aesthetic, but profoundly autobiographical, symbolizing multiple facets of her identity as a woman, as a lesbian, as a Muslim. This layering of identity in a single, deceptively simple image also exemplifies the subtle power of her work. Karimji's artistic and critical interventions took on not just the legacies of British Empire, but also challenged entrenched cultural attitudes towards queerness within Indian and South Asian contexts. Sunil Gupta lauds this intervention as historic, marking it as one of the earliest openly lesbian Muslim contributions to print and visual culture. Karimji's work carved out a foundation that we shall see in later artists taking this further, making it visible, and queerness that has long been rendered invisible, or unspeakable. Pratibha Parmar, who many of you will know in this room, his contribution to queer South Asian cultural production is perhaps famously encapsulated in her groundbreaking film, Kush, 1991. The film serves as a pivotal entry point for understanding the politics surrounding the South Asian queer diaspora in Britain. Born in Nairobi and migrated to UK in the 1960s, Parmar's own background as a queer South Asian migrant deeply informs her work. Her activism in feminist and anti-racist movements shaped her filmmaking practice, allowing her to situate personal narratives within broader political and historical contexts. Kush, which translates to happy, critically examines the roots of homophobia within South Asian diasporic communities, tracing these roots back to colonialism and its enduring cultural legacies. Parmar herself insists, "I do not speak from a position of marginalization, but more crucially, from the resistance to that marginalization." This statement encapsulates the defiance, resilience, and the creative energy of her work. Kush broke new ground, not only thematically, but also institutionally. It was one of the first queer-themed films by a South Asian woman that was broadcast on Channel 4. It reached wider audiences and went on to win several awards. Its format was hybrid, using a documentary style that combined interviews, performance, and archival footage with visual motifs drawn from Indian iconography. This layering also allowed Parmar to explore hybrid identities, many of her interviewees reflecting on the dual influence of their South Asianness alongside the lives that they were living in Britain. This juxtaposition drew attention to the legacy of colonial displacement with scattered communities across London. Scholars like Gayatri Gopinath have recognized the significance of Kush. In Impossible Desires, Gopinath highlights how this film uses familiar Bollywood tropes to enable queer diasporic audiences to reclaim the symbolic space of the nation. By borrowing from popular cultural codes while infusing them with queer meaning, Parmar was also disrupting dominant archives that too often erase racialized and indigenous queer histories. Instead of allowing queer archives to remain tethered to whiteness, Kush inserts South Asian queer lives into the cultural record, documenting how creative strategies of survival and resistance are woven into South Asian queerness. It is also important to consider the conditions under which this work was being produced. Projects like Kush were often unfunded or grossly underfunded. They were driven less by financial resources than by affective and political labor. It was a desire to tell silent stories and create cultural interventions. Artists such as Pratibha Parmar, Ian Iqbal Rashid, Sunil Gupta, and others have noted the importance of progressive institutions like the Greater London Council, like Channel 4, and like a lot of London local authorities of that time, which was supporting artists of color and queer cultural production. So for example, there was a film called Resisting AIDS by Pratibha, which I will show you a still from later on, which was funded by the London Borough of Lambeth. I mean, the idea that London boroughs would be able to fund something like that today is just not going to happen. Without such bodies, many of these voices would have remained unheard. Parmar's earlier short film, Sari Red, in 1988, exemplifies her commitment to confronting the intersections of racism and gendered violence. Created in response to the racially motivated murder of Kulbinder Kaur Hair, Sari Red functions as both a video art and as an elegiac tribute. The title references the red of spilled blood, symbolizing the violence inflicted on South Asian women through racism. The film juxtaposes images of blood-splattered brick wall with words like blood red, cherry red, plum red, sari red, evoking the brutality of racial violence. Other sequences include chants, such as the ones I've put over there, which reverberate with disquieting force, underscoring the daily hostilities faced by South Asians in Britain. These elements, combined with Indian iconography, images of goddesses, women in saris, frame the resilience and cultural survival within this traumatic space that you were inhabiting. The result, this film, if you haven't watched it, is a visceral, poetic piece of video art that moves beyond documentary into a very affective register, demanding audiences not only witness, but feel the violence that is being depicted. This distinctive style, merging political urgency with poetic form, characterizes much of Parmar's work. She has spoken about how the late 1980s and early 90s were marked by the emergence of Black and Asian artists in UK who built communities of mutual support. Queer artists of color, in particular, collaborated very closely. Parmar recalls her close friendship with the filmmaker Isaac Julian, noting that both were openly gay at a time when few Black or Asian artists were able to. Their work not only contributed to the Black arts movement, but also infused it with explicitly queer perspectives. This is demonstrated in films such as Reframing AIDS, which featured contributions from artists such as Sunil Gupta, from Isaac Julian, Kubina Mercer, Simon Watney, and others. At a moment when the AIDS crisis was surrounded by stigma, silence, and fear, the film foregrounded solidarity and visibility and showed how artists of color could intervene within these urgent debates. So I'll turn to the final figure. Turning to Sunil Gupta, one encounters an equally influential figure whose work documents and critiques both the lived realities of queer life and the larger political structures shaping them. Born in India, Gupta migrated with his family to Canada, arriving shortly after the Stonewall Uprising. Though Canada offered some exposure to a growing gay liberation movement, Gupta found it deeply exclusionary for migrants. His subsequent move to New York led him to abandon his business studies for photography, and eventually in 1977, he relocated to London. Gupta's early years was marked by a hostile political climate. South Asian gay men like himself was confronting not only homophobia, but the virulent racism of Powell, of Thatcherism, and far-right street violence. Conservative policies like Section 28, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality in schools, created this environment of fear and exclusion. But also, such repression catalyzed new forms of art making. For Gupta, the art school environment was itself fraught. Gay work was frowned upon, so he went to Royal College of Art, and the queer movement that he had encountered in New York was completely omitted over here in the UK. Yet it was through those challenges that he connected with other Black and Asian artists, and eventually with organizations like GLC, which supported these minority art initiatives. Gupta's oeuvre spans several decades and contexts, but certain themes recur: the documentation of queer intimacy, the politics of representation, and collective histories. His series, the one I have over here, called Pretended Family Relationships in 1988, was created in response to Section 28, which brings together portraits of same-sex couples with poetry and protest and imagery. So you can see there are kind of 3 frames over here. For those of you who don't know, that's actually Pratibha Parmar. So as I was saying, there was a lot of this collaborating work together. So you've got, so in each of these frames, and it's like a whole series, you've got one frame which shows kind of queer couples in kind of intimate, and then you've got the final one over there, which was basically images from the London Pride protests, and then you've got poetry in the middle frame. In these works, intimacy is not apolitical, but explicitly tied to activism. The couples are framed not only as private individuals, as part of a broader movement resisting state oppression. And it was Gupta's ability to merge the affective power of queer relationships with the urgency of protest, which highlights the inseparability of love and politics in queer life. Gupta also co-curated the exhibition and the book Ecstatic Antibodies in 1990 with Tessa Boffin, which sought to reframe the cultural narrative surrounding AIDS. At a time when media coverage pathologized those lives living with HIV/AIDS, the project emphasized love, desire, and resilience, bodies that were visible but were excluded. By centering Black and Asian experiences within the epidemic, Gupta challenged the whiteness of mainstream representation and asserted the need for culturally diverse responses. His broader work continually underscores how race and sexuality intersect within structures of biopolitics and necropolitics, which lives are seen as livable and which are deemed expendable. I did promise Sumi that I would have chalte chalte, so I will tell you why I have this video in a minute. Gupta's video art, though less widely discussed, has also played a very important role. Gupta shot film, India Postcard. Let me play that for you first, a little bit. So the film India Postcard serves as a kind of greeting from gay men in India to the queer community in the United Kingdom. The film begins with 2 characters unconsciously meeting, accompanied also by the song Chalte Chalte from the camp classic Pakisa. Gupta chose this well-known cultural device to convey queerness in India to British audiences without feeling the need for explicit explanation. Additionally, he also recognized the potential for queer pleasure that South Asian queer audiences in the diaspora could derive from such cultural references. Defending his aesthetic choice, Gupta emphasizes, one of the most limiting aspects of trying to make work within a foreign dominant culture is constantly having to explain one's references. In short pieces, that means using up most of the duration of the film or tape, simply explaining away what it's like to be a double minority with very little room left for pleasure or developing particular stories. So again, this was a film that was shown in Channel 4 in 1994. Indeed, Gupta's work serves to center the experiences and narratives of queer South Asians within a global context, particularly in the face of colonial-era homophobic legislation. by incorporating cultural references that may not be immediately understandable to a Eurocentric audience, Gupta is also reaffirming the right of queer South Asians to assert their identities and stories in their own terms. This approach challenges the dominant narratives that have often been overlooked or marginalized in non-Western perspectives within discussions of queer art. So, let me close now. Let me close by drawing all of these threads together. What I've outlined today is not a straightforward or a linear history, but what might be called an archipelago of practices. Thank you so much, SM, for that word. I remember from your lecture. Nightlife, print culture, artistic interventions, and kinship networks. Each of these domains demonstrate that queer South Asian cultural production in Britain has never been marginal or secondary. Rather, it has been central to shaping how we think about migration, race, queerness, and politics in this country. These cultural and political practices are reminders that marginality is never exclusion, but can also be a fertile space for creativity, resistance, and new kinds of world-making. The period I've discussed represents a significant moment of transnational organizing. Queer South Asian diasporic communities across North America, Europe, and South Asia came together, building solidarities that transcended borders. They disrupted heteronormative ordering of life, created alternatives, but also created lots of exclusions on caste, on class, on race, on religion. It is important to also situate these narratives within the broader historical context of colonialism. As Rahul Rao notes, colonial governmentality reshaped how native elites perceive their identities and bodies through the eyes of their colonizers. This matters because queer subjectivity in South Asia and its diasporas has been shaped and often constrained by rigid imperial heteronormative structures. Those same structures that privilege certain kinds of identity and belonging, whilst rendering others as being too deviant or illegitimate. Against this backdrop, the story of queer liberation takes a new dimension when centered on South Asian queers in Britain. Their struggles were not only against homophobia, but against racism and often facing exclusion in multiple fronts. These are messy stories. They reveal fractures within communities, tensions over resources, struggles with funding regimes, and lots of social hierarchies. South Asia we're talking about. Yet they also reveal resilience, they reveal creativity, and they reveal kinship. They force us to ask why certain figures and movements have been pushed to the margins of history and what it would mean to recenter them. As Cyrus Marcus Ware reminds us, we need to consider what we want to remember, how we want to remember it, building an archive of our movements, going forward to ensure that intergenerational memory can inform our activism, community building, and organizing. Thank you.
Wow. What an absolutely smashing lecture. It was just absolutely brilliant. Fantastic. Okay, so now we're going to turn to Q&A, which is your chance to think with Rohit about, how fantastic the lecture was. Yes, really, really brilliant. And it's telling such affecting and just story, a different story of queer liberation, right? And those different stories need to be told, and told not as separate stories, but interwoven through the structures of power that all of us are implicated and complicit in, right? But affected very differently. So I thank you for that interwoven story. Okay, so Q&A, what I'm going to do is that I'm looking at the time, and we have 26 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to take maybe 3 questions together. And so when you're asking your questions, just say who you are very quickly, and then just, pose your question to Rohit. It could be a question, it could be a clarification, it could be not really a comment, no. In the first instance, no. But really a question, a clarification, yeah. and or maybe even a note of appreciation. It could be any one of those. So I'm going to collect, right? And then we'll take the first round, and then you get a chance to ask the second. But remember, we have 26 minutes, so not much. So I'm seeing, at the moment, I'm seeing 2 hands. And can I see one more? So I see 3. Okay, so first, actually, I could take 4 if that was fine. So I'll take SM. I'll take the question in front of you, Nile. There's one Molika, your question. And then I'll take Carrie. Is that okay? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm a GPI student.
You could say your name. That's okay.
Vero is my name, and thank you, first of all. This was very inspiring and very informational for someone who doesn't know much about queer South Asian diaspora here in London. I have a very small question. Does Shakti mean anything, the word that was the name of this newspaper and the club?
Okay. Thank you. SM, please. SM is here.
I can project. Okay. Thank you so much, Rohit. That was beautiful. Since I feel provoked by, the archipelagic thinking, I know that this thread is here, and I really wanted to ask you to kind of continue to just let us know. If we're thinking archipelagically here, and about these kind of formations, these diasporic formations, it sounds like part of what you were presenting is how diasporic figures and activism is like mediated by different structures according to how we imagine the connection itself, right? So if we imagine the archipelago as Birmingham and London, or different sites in London, the political formation looks like this, and it's articulated in this kind of way, and the moment that moves and becomes, it's like it hits these kind of class factors, it hits these educational factors, et cetera, and it's reimagined in a different way once the diaspora connects to different islands, right? And I'm using islands metaphorically here. So I guess I'm wondering, what is that thread? What is our takeaway here for what you're saying happens for queer South Asian kind of culture and politic according to how that archipelago is imagined?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Devika, and I once again have a question. I'm a MSc Gender Globalization Development student, and I wrote my question down, so I'm just going to read it. What I took away from this very, very eye-opening lecture was that queer joy is also a form of resistance, and especially in the face of backlash and marginalization. But even in queer joy, there is a lot of hierarchy. Who feels that joy? Who celebrates that joy? And so what does it mean for us, and especially me and I'm sure there's a lot of us here who are queer scholars, to keep that queer joy alive, but also not forget the lives that slip through those margins, because there are so many. And so yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Carrie. Carrie's right in front.
Sorry, I'm doing great much over this.
Rohit, thank you so much. It was marvelous. I want to pick up on the theme of the 80s in particular, and the public funding and public space that was available to help to, get these projects off the ground, sustain them, and jump forward a bit and just get your thoughts a bit on what the lack of that, the lack of a GLC, the fantasy that Lambeth Council or Hackney or Newham Council, for example, would fund a queer Asian film. Wow, what an idea. Just get your thoughts a bit about both on the kind of, I guess, the challenges, and also on the inventiveness that those challenges are presumably also kind of, producing. Yeah.
Thank you for questions.
Okay, thank you so much for all of those questions. The first one's going to be a very short answer. So Shakti means power. but Shakti also over here represents goddess Shakti, so also kind of a deity, so like a feminine deity related to power. But Shakti on its own means power. So sorry, I should have mentioned that. The second question, that's very, very important. And I think, as I was trying to say, the demise of Shakti literally happened because they moved away in some ways from thinking in that sense of like, we have got a constituency in Bradford, in Manchester, in London, who might all also through, they would have different sort of, class politics, and who were you kind of working with, and this kind of entire move, and also kind of working through that umbrella of political black. So most of the people that I've interviewed in, who were doing that activism in the 70s and 80s all talk about, with a lot of fondness, about political blackness, without necessarily interrogating that how in some ways that also invisibilized the way in which, there's a lot of exclusion that happens. But in many ways, this kind of moving away from political blackness also had its own issues, kind of, thinking much more about India and South Asia becoming the kind of area that they started looking at. And some of the issues, so there were in total, I think we looked at around 300 pages of Shakti, like both in terms of the reports and in terms of the magazines that they published. And you could kind of see it. Like there was like this real try to say, this is happening in India, but it's obviously important to you, a working class Asian man in Bradford. Like there was nothing. But so that's what also led to the demise of Shakti in many ways, the magazine kind of folding up. So I think that's really important. But also, I should say that, one of the kind of areas of research, or what could be like one of the limitations, was a lot of the focus has been on London very predominantly, but that's also because of the archives. So for example, a lot of the kind of the Camden archives are in Glasgow Women's Library. A lot of the Shakti archives are basically there. There's actually some in LSE as well. Bishopsgate, and looking at the Haringey Museum Services. Even some of the stuff that I found in the One Archives in LA was also very London-centric. And I do remember having spoken to some scholars who said that that was a big mistake in some ways, like not thinking, but it was one of those limitations. So a lot of what I'm also saying is a bit London-centric. I should say that. I'm sure there was other amazing things happening in Manchester and Liverpool and Glasgow. I just don't know about it. Queer Joy, yes. I don't know actually. I actually don't know how to answer that question, because I absolutely think, yeah, of course, and I think that also in some ways goes back to the point I was making about nightlife, that, about world making. Whose world is it that we're making? Who has got the privilege to enter those spaces? And how are we thinking about joy? And I think that's such a question of kind of, especially in the South Asian context, of class, of caste, of religion. Even now you can go into South Asian spaces. I won't take the name of an organization now, a very contemporary organization based in Britain. I'm saying a lot over here already, South Asian Queer Organization, which is also extremely ethnocentric in terms of how they see themselves, like, questioning the use of the term South Asia, for example. Why are you not saying Indian, for example? So, when you are creating those kinds of spaces, one does need to question, whose joy is it? And how do we kind of question and query that as well? It doesn't completely answer your question, but I hope I've kind of tried to make a point over there. 80s public space funding. Carrie, it was, when I did this kind of a version of this presentation in North America, everyone was like, but, we've never had this. Like, the way, the kind of diasporic cultural production, we've never had this. It doesn't exist. So how brilliant it has been that these could be sustained through it. So I think absolutely, it played a huge role. So very funnily, so one of the people I interviewed is the filmmaker Ian Iqbal Rashid, who made Surviving Sabu and Touch of Pink. So I remember speaking to him, and I was like, so what happened? Because he came from Canada, right? And I remember him telling me when we were talking about funding, he was like, yeah, but by the time I had come to Britain, all the money had already been mopped up by Sunil and Pratibha. There was nothing left for me. But it was also the changing way, because the money had also become much smaller. GLC getting abolished in '86. Thatcherism coming in. So a lot of that money has gone. And yes, I mean, so for example, Croydon Council, I think 2 years before, funded South Asian Pride. Black Pride does not get funding from any kind of London councils. It relies completely on some very dodgy corporate funding. So yes, there is something to be definitely said about that.
Okay, so we have 15 minutes. So I'm going to take another round of questions. Okay, so Claire, right in front. Yes, Radhika. And then 2 questions at the back. So yes, you, yeah. And then there's one there. That's the one, yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi, Rohit.
Sorry. First it's Claire, and then yes.
I've got one.
Yes.
Thanks so much. I mean, just wow in terms of all the different histories and interlocking moments and Channel 4 and all of this. But I guess, I mean, I also think it's so important what you've been doing here in terms of challenging, I mean, you say that implicitly, but the specific challenge to a particular understanding of gay liberation and a particular understanding of a progress narrative that sees that detailed attention to the intersections between sexuality, class, and not really, race, but also racism and anti-fascist mobilization, which really made me, it made me think, one, about the influence of, as well, or the intersection with My Beautiful Laundrette, yes, which I recently rewatched, which for anybody who hasn't seen it on Gender, Media and Culture has to, but which could barely be made now, right? But which that intersection between anti-fascist, gay, working class, and black and brown kind of intervention, which we think of as something that happens post-intersectionality, is what you're charting here in the most beautiful ways. So I wanted to just say thank you. But then I also wanted to ask you one point. You just said me, and I couldn't tell whether you were talking about a quote or whether you actually were putting yourself in this picture. And I just wanted to know what the impact of this material that you're presenting us to us so beautifully, what impact it had on you.
Yes, wonderful. Radhika.
Hi Rohit, thank you for this beautiful lecture. I want to hone in a little bit on the queer exclusions, a little more about what travels rather than just who travels. I suppose in the who travels, it's mostly the privileged caste Hindu communities from India who travel. But then in the what, it's interesting that you played Chalte Chalte, which Meena Kumari, who played as the wife, a sex worker, danced to in the original film. And a lot of the queer South Asian culture is reappropriated from oppressed caste cultures and even Adivasi cultures, whereas the communities don't get to travel and their culture gets reappropriated. So based on your findings, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you. And then there were 2, yes, yes, you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stella. I'm in GDG. And my question is specifically, I think you were saying Sunil was between New York City and London. And since it is in the 80s, I think it goes a long way to talk about the impact of the AIDS crisis. He obviously wrote about that, like you saw. There were 2 things specifically. And I was just wondering if you could speak to the impact of the AIDS crisis on his art, and especially I think as it relates to queer joy and loss. And I think I'd be curious to see if there are any themes that show up often because of his time in New York City during the 80s.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm one of the students in the MSc Gender, Peace and Security cohort. My question, I wanted to follow up on the comment you made briefly about the inclusion or visibility or lack thereof of trans people in Club Cali, and just ask if you could speak more about that and what you found so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, right. So 4 questions,
Yeah.
and quite a lot of time, 11 minutes.
Brilliant. I will be quick. So just let me start with the last one first. So actually, I wasn't talking about that in relation to Club Kali. I was talking that in relation to Shakti. Because so in the book, we do talk about this one particular incident that happened where there was a lot of transphobia, and there was also just generally, like, it was seen that, you know, if you were cross-dressing or if you were kind of, you know, doing anything different that was genderqueer, it was seen as threatening, and there was actually a huge fight. And when Club Kali opened, one of the things that DJ Ritu then did was like, we welcome all the chutney queens to Club Kali. And and that was actually almost like, it's a longer history which I won't be able to go into right now, but that was a huge issue. And in many ways, you know, when we think about, I mean, if you think about some feminist organizations, even now, South Asian feminist organizations now, which quote unquote are very left, quote unquote left, you know, who are also very, very, very transphobic. And I think, you know, that you can see that it's very much in the left anyways. And that was something that also, you know, we saw within some of the work that we were doing. And also when we have been talking to a lot of the people that we've interviewed in the book. I mean, to give you another example, when the book was written and also when we did the transcripts, it was sent to every single people, and actually there was 4 or 5 people who then, after the book had been typeset, said, I don't want this in the book because it was messy, but I wanted to also tell a messy story. So yeah, AIDS crisis, and Sunil. So Sunil's actually one of the few queer artists who is also very open about their HIV status as being positive. One of the work that they have done on New York is called Christopher Street, which you can have a look at. It's a brilliant kind of series, but they've also done work about, like, both video as well as photographic work about their own kind of, you know, AIDS and so on. So they do kind of do that work even now. And of course, you know, I do mention the kind of the exhibition with Tessa Boffin, ecstatic antibodies, which has this beautiful, beautiful piece, by the way, by Stuart Hall, you know, which also talks about how important it was that, you know, when the whole AIDS crisis was being framed through, like, it's happening to white gay men, it was completely, you know, taking away the fact that, no, it's also impacting other communities. So, yeah. Then there was a question about queer exclusion, what gets you trouble? Oh, yes, yeah, that was Radhika's question. Yeah, think about tamasha, right? Think about tamasha and the way, you know, that gets appropriated everywhere, even though it has come from, you know, Dalit and from working class. And this is the case with anything. There was this article I remember reading a while ago about women fight for rights, but ladies get the rights. And that's such a true thing, right? Because, you know, the people who are fighting for the rights, are they actually the recipient of that? So I do remember also, right, currently in India with the whole kind of Equal Marriage Act. And one of the questions that an activist who you may or may not know, and some others might in this room might know, Chainika Shah, wrote very clearly that that there is no queer community in India, or there's no one singular queer organizing in India, because those people who are fighting for same-sex marriage are not those people who are fighting for you know, vertical reservations for trans people. And that's such a true thing, because it is such a classed and caste affair. Like, you know, what kind of rights are we fighting for? And even I remember within Section 377, where there was a lot of conversation, even then, in terms of some of which I think I do talk about in my book, where, you know, like, what are we fighting for? Is it just the fight to the right to have a private life, to have sex in private? In which case, who has the privilege to have that, right? So there was I remember there was this huge discussion. And like Naisarki's book is a really, really good one in terms of, you know, which charts that whole history, that even the fight against Section 377 was not as intersectional as you think of it, because there was all of these questions, right? What are we actually fighting for? Is it just the right to consume love in private? If so, who is it actually doing? So and that the same can be said about, I think, your example, the same culture which is so anti-sex work, but then also appropriating the wife and kind of making it into a camp classic. But will they open their doors into a club? Yeah, so absolutely. And then your question about the impact it had on me. So Claire, I really struggled when I applied for the funding for this project because, and I don't know if anyone else has this, but I didn't know whether this was my story to tell. I really did struggle with that because I'm like, I wasn't born here. Am I the right person to tell this story? And when I did start kind of reading it and, kind of going to the archives, doing those interviews, and I remember I asked someone, at what point does a migrant become diasporic? And there was no answer to that. And I think for me, it was also like, I think one of the things that a lot of older activists has always said is the problem is we keep reinventing the wheel. Everyone is like, I'm the first drag performer, I'm the first queer this activist, I'm the first this. Whereas actually you're probably not, but there is just no way in which that history gets told, or even within those kind of queer London histories. So I think for me it was a learning process for me as well. I knew a lot of these characters and people very well, but kind of really delving in, understanding, because for me, Shiv Khan, who founded NAS Project London, then went on to found NAS Foundation India, which then fought against Section 377. So there is all of those transnational connections over here. But yeah, for me it was eye-opening, but also I did kind of grapple with some of the ethical dilemmas of, am I the person to tell this?
Okay, so we still have a couple of minutes. If anybody wants to get one right in, or I can just exercise my chair's privilege and ask. But I should not do that, so I've been stopped in time. Okay, so I'm going to give you a chance, and I'm going to give you, but you have to be very, very quick.
I'll give you one-word answers.
Go for it, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Nishtha. I'm a recent graduate in gender studies. Thank you so much for that fantastic lecture. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the politics of queer asylum in the period, and asylum specifically on the basis of your sexual or gendered identity, and the various references you might have found in the cultural productions that you're looking at. I know that pretended family relationships, it does speak to this burden of providing evidence of your queer identity.
Thank you so much. Yes, please.
I'm sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. I'm Kuhu. I just wanted to understand that since a lot of this queer mobilization happened at times where there was intense racial, there was a lot of racism at that point in time. I feel like a lot of times where there is some sort of threat to your cultural existence in a place, there is always this question of who is supposed to protect the culture, what does the culture hold, and a lot of times that does not include queer performances. And with that in mind, who ended up being in this diasporic space, the protectors of this culture, of queerness, and then who was able to go for these nightclubs, events, prides, and then eventually support clubs.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's
Okay.
great. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, I'll give very quick answers, but I'm happy to have this conversation with you both outside over drinks. So in terms of, so there was quite a lot of kind of artwork that was being produced. At that time, I mean, for example, Sunil's work, Exiles, is a really, really good example of it, which was absolutely responding to kind of that kind of migration. But also in terms of queer asylum. So there's a funny story over here, actually. Can I say that?
Yes, yes.
So this was supposed to be a very different project. So this project was called Cross-Border Queers, and we were going to be interviewing asylum seekers and migrants from South Asia to UK. And then we did our first workshop, and we were supposed to go to 4 countries. We did our first workshop, and then COVID happened. And we completely changed the project. But there is actually some really good archival material that never made it into this book, but there's very little, not very little, very little that I have, but there is a project there. There's a project. Maybe you should do it, or someone else, but there is a project there. But yeah, in terms of artwork, I would say that. that was many questions, but all very, very brilliant questions. So I would say that I've actually forgotten some of the questions, but I would. Can we have this conversation outside? I've actually forgotten, like my mind is drawing a blank.
Who gets to enter those spaces?
Oh, who gets to enter those spaces? So I think it probably is the answer I've given a bit earlier already, but yeah, I can have that conversation with you afterwards. Sorry, I've had a bit of a brain fog now.
Less of a question, more of a comment. We're going to have drinks now. You're going to put a bow on this. If you go outside, there's a table on the left. Those are our drinks. There's a table on the right. Those are not our drinks. So just... There's another event.
But take those first.
Yes,
Take those
invade them.
So just remember, stay on the left. Thank you.
Okay, fine. But you know, we could be space invaders, right? Okay, anyway, so I just want to echo everyone in the audience, because that's what I've heard from all of you, that this was an absolutely smashing, brilliant, wonderful lecture. Thank you so much.